All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Meeting Deer's Nutritional Needs Through Food Plots. I'm happy to welcome Jacob Dykes and Paul Gross, who will be our presenters tonight. My name is Katie Oker. I am a Michigan State University chronic wasting disease educator. And we have a few functions in Zoom that we can use tonight to interact with you. Number one being, we'll use poll questions. So if you can tell me, have you ever participated in an MSU extension program before this webinar? And I can see kind of the number of folks that are responding. So we'll give you a few seconds to respond to that. Okay, so welcome to a lot of people who have never experienced an MSU program. I hope that you enjoy this as much as I've enjoyed putting it together and enjoyed working with Paul and Jacob to make this opportunity available for you. So just a reminder that MSU is open to all, regardless of political affiliation. We're an equal opportunity employer, national origin, sex, all of those things. So thank you so much. With that, let me see. Okay, I stopped sharing. So the other features of our Zoom tonight will be the chat pod. If you look at the bottom ribbon on your screen, you'll see the box that's labeled chat. If at any point in time you're asked to interact with the presenters through the chat bar, just push that and then a text box will appear and you can type in your answer to that. The last feature that we're going to use tonight is the question and answer chat pod that is called Q&A on the bottom of your screen again. If at any point during the presentation you have any questions, please feel free to pop those in the chat pod and we'll either answer them live or via the text function in that chat pod, and they'll then be, as they're answered, they'll be moved over into a public viewing so that everybody can see the answers. So please don't feel like you have to hold your questions to the end. Make sure you pop those in the chat pod, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll do live questions for any of those questions that didn't get answered. I'm so excited that we've got over 130 people registered for this webinar tonight from all across the country. So that's great. Thank you so much for participating. And with that, I will turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Katie. I'm going to share my screen if I can. Well, I'm really thrilled to be here today. I'm Paul Gross. I'm an extension educator in Central Michigan, and I really appreciate the invite from Katie. My primary responsibilities are field crops, and I work a lot with cover crops and soil health. And Katie asked me to participate to kind of answer some of the soil questions that might happen. So I kind of feel like the warm-up band because I'm actually pretty excited to hear Jacob talk myself. So I'm going to kind of keep it short and keep it kind of basic and simple when I talk about some of the things, soil related, because when you signed up, there were several questions that you had, the things you wanted to get out of this webinar, and some of them include some soil related things, preparing the soil, some of the best practices for fertilization, how do I work with sandy soils, and what about soil health and those things. So I'm going to kind of touch primarily on some of those things. But when I think about deer plots, and I do a few of those myself, have actually a lot of fun with it. But we got to start with the end in mind. We'd certainly like to have a plot like this, and I'm going to let Jacob evaluate this picture. This is actually a cover crop plot that we took last year. But when you start thinking about your plots, a lot of times you don't have the most ideal soil types and things like that to work with. But I think it's important that when we start thinking about putting these plots in, we got to think about our soil types. We got to think about our site preparation. What are we doing for tillage? and what are we doing for weed control? I mean, I in my experience, uh, weeds taking over a plot are so one of the first things that happen for failures of food plots. So I always like to start off with soil testing, and that's primarily what I'm going to talk about. But when we start looking at our soil types and looking at our soil test results, it'll kind of give us, and we got to think about our climate, where we are geographically. What's really fun about this is we have a lot of folks in the center part of the country, but there's people all across the United States that are registered here tonight. So we really got to think about those things. And we think about soil types, we think about climate, and that's going to influence our species selection. So we can be successful in our establishment. So how good are your soils? They say location, 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 and that's really, really kind of important. But you have to work with what you have. Your food, your hunting property, or where you're putting the food plots in. And one of the first things that I always encourage individuals to do, and this just happens to be the soil survey from a county in Michigan. I always think it's important to get that soil survey, or you can go get the web soil survey from the USDA and see what type of soil you have. See what the classification is and what series it is, because it can lead to a lot of insights into some of the things you can and can't do, and how you might manage some of those soils that you're going to establish those plots on to make some of those things that Jacob is going to talk about be successful. So we always start with soil testing. I think that's probably the most important thing that we need to do if we're going to establish a plot successfully. We never let the dentist drill in our teeth until they take an X-ray. Why would we not do some soil testing? And it's really the basis for understanding our lime and fertilizer needs. If we got problems, evaluate the nutrient balances in our soil. We want to protect the environment. Sometimes, if 10 pounds is good, 20 pounds ought to be twice as good, right? Well, some of the nutrients that you're working with or dealing with can be, they're very leachable. So we need to think about that. In those soil testing, depending on what you select type, it can give you an idea of what your organic matter is. We can also get compost analysis and those different types of things. It can give you a tremendous amount of insight to the food plot that you're working on, especially the soils. It gives us an idea whether we have, I think it's really important when I think about managing soils is, what do we have? Or would we have a silty loam? Do we have a sand? Do we have a clay? There's a lot of species that are more or less adaptable to some of those. So, but those tests help give us those clues. One of the real key things I think about soil testing is what is our pH? In my with my recommendations, I get that soil test, and one of the first things I look at is the pH. We got to have our pH right, because when we have our pH right, if you look at this particular table, you see the nutrient availability of a lot of our micronutrients as well as our macronutrients. So it's real critical. It's also critical for species selection. Some species do well in more acid soil. Some of them love acid soil, as opposed to some of them like a little more alkaline, especially you get some of the legumes. So it's, when I make recommendations, I always get the soil test, look at your pH, and lime is the first nutrient that you buy. How do you take the soil test? It's, there's a lot of different ways to take it. These are some of the tools of the trade. I think it's more important to take the test than the tool that you use. I always suggest that people go to your local county extension office, go to your local co-op, the individuals that you do some of your agronomy, buy your inputs with, they can assist you with the soil test. But the big thing is the test, just so you're not guessing. How do we take the test? We want to make sure they're really random in your plot. And this is just kind of an example. You want to stay away from the edges. And what you want to do is get a lot of subsamples. Try to get 5 or 6 probes per acre, or if there's a soil change in within that plot. A lot of times it depends on the size of your plot as well. But avoid those odd spots. But make it representative. Make it representative of the plot you're working with, and always use a plastic bucket, plastic bag, paper sack. Don't use a metal bucket. It can skew some of those micronutrients that you might be a big concern with some of the species you might be planting. Taking the soils. When do you take it? my recommendation always is to take it at the same time every year. It doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily have to, is the spring better, is the summer better, is the fall better? What I'd like to always tell people is take it the same time every year. So you get similar soil moisture, similar plant growth, because you have a whole lot of things that happen when the soils warm up, when they're wet, when they're dry, but the nutrient content should be the same, but take them the same. And as an example, take those small, how do we do it? We just take those small subsamples. Usually when you're only going to submit about a pint of soil total into that sample. So you get those subsamples, mix them together, make sure they're kind of dry. You don't want them soaking wet. Fill out the forms completely to designate what you're growing, because I know in the Michigan State Lab, we have opportunities to talk about, grass, legumes, brassicas, a lot of those different. And then if you have mixes, so it'll make those fertilizer recommendations based on what you're trying to grow. And then once you get those results back, this is just an example of a wildlife forage at the MSU soil testing lab. You're going to see the different labs will have different soil test reports. But if you look at this particular one, we see right up on top, upper left, the nutrient levels of soil. We see the soil pH is 7.5. That's pretty high for Michigan, for a lot of the areas. We see our phosphorus is it's in part per million. It's optimum for the crop we're going. One of the things I always kind of point out when we're interpreting these results is when you got your nutrient levels, when it means optimum for that forage legume that you're growing. Our phosphate's optimum, potassium's a little low, magnesium's high. Then we got another calcium, the cation exchange capacity, exchange weight, a lot of those other things that I'm not going to go into now. But your advisor, your extension educator can help you with those. But then you got your expected yield is 4 tons, and then it gives you a recommendation of how much nitrogen. In this particular case, it's 0 nitrogen recommendation because it's a legume. The phosphate's 50 pounds, the potassium's 205 pounds. So, and then you can have a second one for a second crop recommendation like you see here. What fertilizers you do is how much. That soil test will help you determine that. A lot of different fertilizers, like the 624-24 is kind of a standard fertilizer if you don't need a lot of nitrogen, but you need some phosphate or potash. In a fertilizer in these 3 numbers, the first is nitrogen, second is phosphate, and the third is potassium. A lot of people use what I call them triples, like triple 12, triple 15, triple 19, all good fertilizers, but you can work with your advisor to help you calculate the right amounts so you get the right amount on for success of those plots. Soil health, I'll talk about that a little bit. Organic matter is the key to soil health. Things that you can do to improve your organic matter. I know one of the questions the person wanted to know how to improve sandy soils. The best thing you can do is try to continue to improve your organic matter. And how do we do that? We try to till as little as possible. We have a constant cover, constant canopy, protect and shield that soil, have plant diversity, and food plots are the greatest thing for getting that plant diversity in there. And then one of the keys to me is take the live root challenge, and in those plots, in those fields, you should have live roots growing as many months a year and many days a year as possible. And then adding livestock, which means adding manure and those types of things are things that can improve your health, your soil health. So building organic matter, it's one of the keys to soil health, but it's a slow process. We want to continue to have plants growing. We get the breakdown of the plants, and we got a really kind of a nice cycle here in this diagram where we get the plant residue, the compounds decays by those microbial communities, and then eventually ends up into some stable organic matter. We can build about 1/10 of the year, so it's going to take quite a while to build up at least 1%. But if you think your soil is going to be a limiting factor, you need to start now to start building that organic matter to make that soil more productive and more healthy. So with that, I'm gonna stop my sharing, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I'll be there at the end to answer questions if people have that are soil related. So I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Katie for Jacob.
All right, thanks, Paul. Please don't forget, if you do have any questions, to pop those in the question and answer pod, and we can get those answered for you. And with that, we'll turn it over to Jacob.
Hey, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Paul, hear me? Okay, good to go. Excellent information, Paul. That's a huge contributing factor whenever we're talking food plots. So yeah, that's excellent information. A little bit about me, if you're not familiar with me, name's Jacob Dykes. I'm a PhD student here at the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute. A lot of what we're going to talk about today, I started getting invested in doing my master's at Mississippi State University. So with that, we'll go ahead and start sharing screens. Does that look good? Awesome. Okay, so super excited to be here. This is a topic that I don't think I'll ever get tired of talking about. It's something that's just really important to me. I'm really passionate about. I'm going to start this talk off like you would any other food plot presentation, and that's by discussing honey buns. So how do we as humans, we're animals, how do we meet our nutritional requirements? Well, we've got it made, right? We're pretty comfortable. We don't usually have to run from predators. We're often not looking for our next meal. And usually, if you're like me, you overeat and you essentially saturate your body with nutrients. And by default, the body works it out and you meet your nutritional requirements. However, when it comes to wildlife, this is not that simple. It's a very complex situation. These things are steadily trying to survive, and they have to consider these things when they say, okay, I'm going to chase this animal for prey, or I'm going to jump these hurdles to go consume this vegetation. They essentially need to make sure they are getting the best bang for their buck to keep them going. When we talk about herbivores, this can be even more complicated because there's something referred to as the evolutionary arms race. So this is herbivores evolved to feed on plants. Plants evolved to prevent herbivores from feeding on them. And these adaptations that plants have, these defenses, are things like thorns and spines, briars, where I come from. If you've been in the deer woods, then you're familiar with these. You've had them wrapped around you at one time or another. There's also chemical toxins, things like that are actually actively trying to prevent these animals from feeding on them. So this just further makes this complex situation of needing to get nutrients from vegetation even more complex, right? So I said this was it's an evolutionary arms race. So the plants evolve, the animals evolve, the plants evolve, and back and forth. There's been really cool adaptations by herbivores to make them more efficient at whatever it is they're feeding on. For instance, this guy in the middle, this is referred to as a geranuk, a very odd looking creature, but it has evolved to be efficient at what it is that it needs to forage on. And I guess something in particular requires them to be able to stand up and reach over and grab it. A really cool adaptation that herbivores have come to have, or some herbivores have come to have, is what we refer to as the rumen. This is a digestive adaptation. So you often hear people say cows have 4 stomachs or deer have 4 stomachs. Well, that's not necessarily true. What they do have is this big storage vat that has 4 compartments in it. And essentially what this apparatus does, that's for a lack of a better term, this adaptation allows these animals to consume really high fiber forages. So say we go out and we are packing this storage vat full of high fiber forages. Well, within this storage vat, there is a microbial population. So microbes, protozoa, bacteria, that kind of thing, that actually breaks this forage down for the animal. So high fiber forage, the longer they can store it, the longer these microbes can work on it. The microbes extract the nutrients, the animal is able to absorb those nutrients. So this adaptation allows animals to feed on high fiber forages that they might not normally be able to. and in an efficient way. But even within ruminants, there is a gradient. So we'll see on the far right here, you have domestic cattle, just your normal cow, right? Very large, very big gut capacity, and a relatively low metabolic rate. So what this allows, it allows cattle to feed on the really, really fibrous stuff. So we're talking, I mean, we've seen what they eat, the grasses, the straws. I mean, some stuff that you just don't understand how they could possibly live off of. Well, what happens is because their metabolic rate is pretty low and their guts are so large, they're able to store that forage, that high fiber forage, for long enough that these microbes are able to break that stuff down, extract the nutrients, and therefore the cattle can absorb those nutrients. If we look on the other end of the spectrum here, we have white-tailed deer. So white-tailed deer are much smaller, their gut capacity is much smaller, and their metabolic rate is relatively higher. Well, for this reason, they don't have time to allow the microbes to break down those really high fiber forages because they need quick shots of energy and quick shots of nutrients. And they just don't have the time to let that forage sit there and ferment. So what they have to do is actively seek out low fiber, nutritious forages. So it looks to something like this in my mind. They are very picky creatures, and they're often referred to as concentrant selectors. And what this means is they actively discriminate and navigate the landscape in a way that not only are they picking low fiber, high quality forage, they're actually even picking different parts of specific plants to make sure that they're getting quickly digestible, high quality forage. And this is already a complicated task, but imagine having to do this and meet caloric needs. So this chart here shows as deer body weight increases, the amount of daily forage also increases. So one thing I want to keep in mind, everybody that's watching, I know there's a lot of people in different areas. Most of what I'm going to talk about is, at least the scale of things, is going to be from the Southeast. So some of you may look at this and say 250-pound deer. Well, that's only half of it. We have 300-pound deer. Where's the rest of this scale? But you can see the trend here. So we'll say 150-pound deer. It's already got a picky diet because it needs highly nutritious, digestible forage. And it needs to eat 5 pounds of that forage a day. So could you imagine right now grabbing a trash bag, walking outside and picking little leaves and twig tips and other small things like that until you had 5 pounds, and then did that every single day? I mean, these animals really have a task on their hands. And nutrition across the landscape and their nutritional needs change throughout the year. So this is one of the things I was referring to say the scale may change a little bit. I know spring green up may occur during different time periods for some people, whether you're farther north or deeper south. But essentially this graph is still maybe needs to be moved on the time frame, but if this is what happens with these animals, this is what they experience. Late winter before spring green up, what's happening is the bucks are coming out of rut, some of which have lost 30% of their body mass, like they're in rough condition. They need nutrients to help build them back up. So that's a stressful period. Then you get over here to August, September, and this is where bucks are building antlers. But on top of that, you've got does that are in the late stages of gestation. So they're about to give birth to fawns, and they're also lactating to feed these fawns. And we know that to be the most stressful time of the year for mammals, period. Like it's tons of stress on these animals. And another thing, this occurs in most places at the hottest time of the year. So then you got to think about how much energy it requires to simply keep your body temperature where it needs to be. And that's a huge energetic drain if you're not familiar with that. But yeah, to maintain thermal regulation is a huge energetic cost. So we look at this and we see, okay, well, those stressful periods make sense. And also we look at this and we're like, wow, the nutrition on the landscape, the groceries on the landscape, pretty scarce during those times too. So let's look at some of the food plot use research that's been done throughout the years. And again, this is going to be in the Southeast, but basically what we're looking at is food plot use by deer throughout throughout the year. And you see these two spikes, January, February, then you see another spike in August, September. Well, that looks familiar, right? So let's invert that and look at that. Look at what we can do when we provide extra groceries on the landscape during certain times of the year. We can really help these critters out, right? I mean, this is such a pretty fit to me. So with all of that in mind, with the complexities that are involved in what is diet selection, it's just not as simple as going and eating that green thing or that green thing. It's a really complex situation. With all of this stuff in mind, we wanted to do a project at Mississippi State University. And we had two objectives for this project. One, we wanted to evaluate the influence of plant nutrients on deer preference. So what I mean is, imagine plant A, plant B. Maybe this is one clover and this is the second clover. Well, that's not what we're so much worried about. What we're worried about is the nutritional composition of plant A and the nutritional composition of plant B. So we wanted to see how these animals were pursuing or avoiding certain nutrients, and we were using plants to offer those nutrients. The second objective is we wanted to evaluate how the nutrients in the soil, which we just learned were so important, how does that affect plant nutrients ultimately? And then how does that ultimately affect deer preference? And we're going to elaborate a lot on this. So if I didn't make any sense just then, maybe I will the second time around. But one of the things as diehard hunters that we wanted to do is make sure that we could connect with the hunters. I mean, we wanted to do this the same way that anybody else would do this. So we literally went to the co-op and we picked 15 of the more common food plot forages in the Southeast. So we have annual clovers, the famous crimson clover and arrowleaf clover. And then we have our brassicas like rape and purple top turnips, and we have oats and rye. I mean, we wanted to throw the kitchen sink at this project, and for two reasons. One, from an extension standpoint, we wanted to evaluate these forages, of course, but also to meet the objectives of the study, we wanted a variety of forages that had a variation in nutritional concentration. And so we threw the kitchen sink at them. And another thing I want to say is we literally went to the co-op and bought these things, nothing fancy about it. And I always will appreciate that about this project. So how did we design the project? Just to kind of give an overall broad explanation is we essentially took these 15 forages and we planted them in same sized adjacent plots. We then put a motion activated game camera at the perimeter at each one of these plots, because we wanted to record deer activity in each plot. We also then covered this entire area, or wrapped this entire area in a three-dimensional electric fence, because we wanted to prevent animals from being able to get in there until we were ready. One of the biggest reasons in this is because we're using such a variety of forages, their maturity dates differ. So as some are starting to establish, others are starting to climax. As some are starting to die, others are starting to climax. It's just, we wanted to make sure that all of these were available when we ran our trials. Again, we wanted to throw the kitchen sink at this thing. So one thing that we did is before each trial, we went in and we took a sample of this forage. We then sent this off to the lab and we measured the concentration of every macro and micro mineral and nutrient that we could possibly afford to account for. And we got a pretty good array here of all the popular crude protein and calcium and phosphorus and all the things that you hear are so important. And then also the things that you don't think about, manganese and molybdenum and things like that. So again, we wanted to account for everything we can or could. So tier one, this is where we're looking at how the nutrients in the plants actually influence deer preference. So there were two ideas behind this. One that is kind of a traditional idea that deer are going to go out and they're going to maximize the consumption of the most high quality forages, right? So we know this is a good one and that's a good one. Let's eat as much as we possibly can of it and flood ourselves with nutrients. But there was another idea, one called the nutrient avoidance hypothesis. And basically this said, okay, well, to relate this to humans, probably most of us walk around with some kind of deficiency of one nutrient or another. I know I don't eat enough vegetables. I don't eat enough fruit. Honey buns, as good as they are not as nutritious as I would like them to be. So we often have a deficiency, right? But that's not always that big of a deal. Maybe we would feel better if we addressed that. However, the results of a toxic amount of something is usually something that's going to put you down. You're usually going to feel those quickly if it doesn't kill you. A toxic amount of anything can be a dangerous situation. So with that idea of maybe that would be the main driver of diet selection. Maybe we have to avoid dying from a toxic amount of something, and then we can maximize after that secondarily. So here's another look of how we set this up. So this is what we consider one block. And this block contained all 15 forages and a fallow plot. The fallow plot was for us to be able to account for just random occurrence, deer walking through and things like that, so that we could adjust our other camera data. So you see this block, and imagine 8 of these. So we had these all over the landscape, and each one of them, we re-randomized the forages so none of them were in the same order. And also keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, when we run a trial, yes, we're using the same forages, but on trial 2, those forages have grown and have continued processing through their life cycle. So therefore, they're steadily changing their nutritional composition. So yeah, we're using the same forage, but the nutritional composition is different from trial 1 and trial 2 and trial 3 and so on. So when we get ready to run a trial, we collected our samples so we know the nutritional analysis or the nutritional composition of each forage. We go out, we drop fences, and we let our cameras take pictures for 2 weeks. One thing that we do, we were considering the forage being used if the deer was putting its head down. So if we were getting pictures of a deer with its head down, then we're like, okay, that's 1 use event, 2 use event, 3 use events. This is actual drone footage of one of the blocks. And as you can see, it's just 15 forages adjacent, one after the other. The cameras are not actually up on this one yet, but they were fashioned in a way that we knew we could tell if a deer was in plot 1, plot 2, plot 3. And again, we had already done a nutritional analysis on these forages, so we knew the nutritional composition at that very time, which is important because, again, the forage was not necessarily the point. It was the nutritional composition. We want to see if they're chasing a certain nutrient or running away from another nutrient. So what did we find? Well, we actually found that deer were actively avoiding plants high in sulfur. So they were, from each trial, actually changing their preference for plants to avoid sulfur. So what they may have enjoyed eating or wanted to eat in trial 1, once it became higher in sulfur to a point, they would actually change and go to another plant. Secondarily, what we saw is they were actually, after avoiding high sulfur, they were changing plant preference based on ones that were higher in crude protein and higher in digestibility. Really, really cool stuff. I mean, they were actively changing their diet to meet their nutritional requirements while avoiding toxic amounts of a nutrient. I mean, to me, that is just amazing. How they know, I'm not sure. Tier 2 of the project. So this is where we're going to dig a little deeper, literally. This is where we wanted to see if soil nutrients actually affected plant nutrients and if plant nutrients actually affected deer preference. Once we had manipulated plant nutrients anyway. So this is a beautiful graphic that I spend entirely too much time on to show you basically what we mean here. And so you'll see from the soil up top to the plant, we wanted to see, all right, if we amend the soil, if we add lime and fertilizer and stuff, will that be reflected in the plant? Can we actually change within a season the nutritional composition of a plant? Secondarily, we wanted to see, okay, well, once we've changed the nutritional composition in certain plants, could we change the preference of deer for those plants? And this on the far left here that says soil nutrients influence deer preference directly or indirectly. What I mean by that is one thing that we had to account for is, because this is science, right? We're actually pouring nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium out on the ground. We had to make sure that that wasn't just attractive to deer by itself. We wanted to make sure that we were manipulating the forage and that they weren't just going to literally eat nutrients out of the dirt. Again, this is science. You have to consider this kind of stuff. So here's another look. This is what we considered a block in this tier of the project. So what we went with is we have 4 plots of Balanza clover, and we have 4 plots of forage wheat. So during this period, forage wheat had already died. It was already really, you've seen it standing where it's essentially just straw at that point. It's not palatable, it's already seeded out, but the biomass is still there. And so Balanza clover 4 plots, forage wheat 4 plots, and then we randomly assigned treatment, 4 treatments. You either got application of lime, you got an application of fertilizer, you got an application of lime and fertilizer, or we didn't do anything. And we did that for Balanza, and we did that for forage, and of course we re-randomized between each of our blocks. The process that we followed was the same as the first tier, in that we collected our samples of the forage itself, sent it off to the lab, and then we also had our cameras going and dropped our electric fences to let deer have access. And here's a picture. This is actually after the trial is completed. You can see the fences are down. We're actually getting all this stuff out of here. The camera's gone, but you could see those wheat plots and then come into the Balanza there, and then the fallow plot and that kind of stuff. We also considered biomass. We knew that we didn't just want the animal going to this is more biomass. So we actually tested that, and the biomass between the Balanza clover and the forage wheat was actually very similar. So we ruled that out as affecting our results. So the first leg of the experiment here, were we able to alter the nutrients in the plants with our soil amendments? And absolutely we were. We actually were able to increase the amount of phosphorus in our plants. This is likely because on our property, we had a phosphorus deficiency. So therefore, that's what these plants were actually searching and were able to uptake and change the phosphorus levels. So yes, we did, which I think is amazing. You know, we talk about how important it is to get your soil right, to amend your soils and apply lime and fertilizer and those kind of things. And we literally did it in a season, and it was pretty amazing. So yeah, we checked that box. Absolutely, we were able to with our lime and fertilizer treatment, actually. So the second tier, okay, on these plants that we were able to affect. So now you've got plants, they look exactly, this was what was fascinating to me. The plants looked exactly the same. I couldn't tell you which one that we had actually changed the nutritional composition of, but somehow these animals knew. And after we ran trial after trial after trial, they specifically sought out these plants that were higher in phosphorus. It was one of the most amazing things to see, because again, standing there, I couldn't point and tell you which one had a higher concentration of phosphorus. They looked the same, but somehow these deer knew. And no matter how we rearranged treatments, and no matter how many times we ran these trials, they were hammering these that had that increased phosphorus concentration. And again, likely phosphorus increase was because we already had a deficiency. It was probably the lowest hole in the bucket, and those plants pulled that phosphorus up, and therefore were able to increase concentrations, and somehow deer were able to discriminate between those. So this is, I know, sounded complicated, but we saw no increase in the use of wheat. Like I said, this forage was no longer palatable. So if we would have seen an increase in use, it would literally have been because somehow we made the soil more attractive or something, and deer may be licking nitrogen and phosphorus off the ground. But we wanted to control for that. And we did not see that at all. It did not change use at all. But we did see that deer changed use of the forages that were affected. So basically, through amending the soil, we then affected the plant, which then the deer changed their preference based off those changes that we were able to make. So yeah, if you can wrap your mind around that, it was absolutely fascinating. So to summarize what we found here, tier one, deer absolutely, their diets were driven by nutrients. Same plants, preference for each plant changed as the nutritional composition of that plant changed. So it's not as simple as, oh, well, crimson clover. Yeah, crimson clover, crimson clover. Well, it's not that simple. Deer also selected plants in a way that avoided certain nutrients. And this actually revealed itself to be the driving factor. So primarily what we saw as this plant may have been great, but as it increased in sulfur concentration, deer left it alone. And even within that, they were also maximizing crude protein. So as a plant that was low in sulfur, which was then okay to have, right? Not toxic amounts. Once it increased in protein, now that was attractive. And these deer actively changed their diet throughout the entire 3 months that we did this experiment. So tier 2 of the project, we amended the soil and we were able to change the nutritional composition of our plants. So again, we're just hammering this point home, but I feel like it's one that's often not, often ignored. But the soil is where it all starts. It's super important, and you can actually make a difference within one season just by amending your soils. And then the second tier also, we found that changes in plant nutrients did affect preference. So again, if you literally want to make a direct effect, it's possible by following the steps that have been preached for years and years and years. And it was fascinating to see. But what does all of this mean? Well, this is where it gets complicated. What we just identified and talked about is how complex this diet is. It is not as simple as, well, that plant does it and that plant doesn't do it. The nutritional needs of these animals are steadily changing. The nutritional composition of the forages are steadily changing. The nutritional composition of the forages on your property are not the same as the nutritional composition of the forages on my property. The soils are different. The nutrients are different. The amount of groceries you have is different than the amount of groceries that I have on my property. It's just not comparable. There is no cookie cutter approach. In fact, some of the similarities we saw, we've done some other vegetation work on my research property and saw that some of the native plants were actually high in sulfur. We do a lot of burning on that property. So it makes sense that they were high in sulfur. So maybe sulfur may not even matter on your property. So again, just remember, there is no cookie cutter approach here. This is a very complex thing. And in my opinion, what this all sums up to be is diversity. If it's up to me, I'm throwing the buffet at them. And I'm going to let them pick and choose so that they can reach their potential. Okay, so we've talked a lot. What's it been, an hour and a half, 3 hours? But we're finally going to talk about implementing a food plot. So, and this is going to be a little bit probably not traditional if you've ever seen another food plot talk, as if starting out talking about food or honey buns was. We're going to go step by step in what I think is important. One, I think it's important to understand why you're planning a food plot. I know this seems a little corny and we're just putting that in there because we're supposed to, but seriously, understanding your objectives and what you want to do and what you need to do is really where it all starts. And you can plant a food plot because you like to take pictures of birds in your food plot. You can do it to increase hunter recruitment. You can do it for any amount of reasons, and they're all perfectly fine. If you just want to plant food plots so that you can shoot deer closer, that's perfectly fine. If you are actually trying to increase nutritional carrying capacity, great, that's awesome. If you're trying to increase, nutrition during those stressful periods that we mentioned, that's another great thing. It doesn't matter. It's just good for you to understand why you're doing it. And that way it'll help you build a successful food plot. Another thing is to, once you know why you're doing it, be realistic. I mean, most of us don't have the money or the means to plant a couple hundred acres of food plots. You're probably not going to grow a 400-inch deer either. Like, you have to understand both economically and biologically where your limitations are. So do not know your objectives, but make sure they are realistic. You're just going to disappoint yourself if they're not. So finally, we got that stuff out of the way. So where are we putting this food plot? Well, I'm trying to make things easier on myself. So if I've got existing openings on the property, they're prime real estate for my food plot, right? If I'm not using them for anything else, why not? Another thing you need to consider, if it's a high traffic area, if this is where you drive every day and it's mostly a mud hole, then you probably don't want to put that food plot there. A lot of common sense things go into where and when to put your food plot. Locate where the deer are, though. I mean, if you know where travel corridors are, or if you know where bedding areas are, use that to your advantage. Again, we're trying to increase diversity across the landscape, and we're trying to bring deer to us. So let's be strategic about it. Another thing is avoid areas that hold too much water. So This seems obvious, but the problem is when you get ready to plant a food plot, there may not be water there. You may need to know your property to know that, hey, 3 months from now, this is going to be a mud hole. And there are a lot of plants that can't tolerate this much. Most aren't going to tolerate something flooded like this, but this is another consideration. Know your property, and then also pick and choose your plants based off what's going to be able to handle the conditions of your property. Another one of those often forgotten about is shade. Plants require sunlight. This is something you should think about. Don't shoot yourself in the foot by picking a poor area on your property. If this is all you have to go with, sure, absolutely. Have fun with this. It's more about having fun, at least to me, and something will grow. So don't shy away from this thinking that, oh, I don't have the right spot. Don't do that at all. Just if you have the opportunity to consider different things, do that. Question I get asked a lot is, do I want narrow plots? Do I want long plots? I guess the implied value there is that narrow plots, closer to cover, deer won't be as vigilant, as scared, things like that. Do I want long uniform plots, or what do I want? My mind in those situations goes to how can I increase diversity, and also how can I increase hunting opportunities? I'm not going to plant one 600-yard food plot unless that's what my property is set up for, a power line or something like that. But what I might do is 2 staggered 300-yard food plots, so that now I've got 2 hunting opportunities if somebody else wants to hunt. Or maybe if I'm clearing out an area for me to do a food plot, I make it curved. Again, increase diversity, make these things more attractive. Maybe that does decrease the perception of fear of deer if they're close to cover and there's a curve instead of this 600-yard lane. You know what I mean? Size. This is always a question, and this is a hard one because there's nothing set in stone. I've often heard if you want to address nutrition on your property, the number that we see a lot is 3%. So if you have a 100-acre property and you want to actually increase the amount of groceries on your property, and you aren't just doing it to increase hunting success, but actually to add nutrients to the property, then 100-acre, we're wanting 3 acres of food plots on a 100-acre property. Like I said, nothing set in stone. You also see, well, how big do I want my food plot? A lot of times we'll say 3 to 5 acres, 2 to 7 acres, something like that. But again, don't let it hold you back, and know what your objectives are. If you're trying to get a deer into bow range, then your objectives are much different than trying to literally bring the amount of deer your property can support, increasing that, right? Also, if I've got a choice between one huge food plot or smaller plots distributed across my property, I'm going smaller plots, absolutely. And when I say smaller, let's be realistic. I don't mean the size of your bedroom. I mean, like, realistically, an acre or 2 there and an acre and 2 there versus 50 acres in one corner of my property. I'm going to distribute more smaller plots across my property. Increase diversity. We're increasing access from other deer. It's just all around a better thing. Increasing hunting opportunities, absolutely. But we are all living in the life of CWD. This is something that we steadily have to consider. We all care about these natural resources. We want them to be there for us in many years to come. We do know that the congregation of deer into small areas can facilitate the spread of CWD. However, there is no research thus far that I'm familiar with that have compared CWD transmission and food plots. And I think it's safe to say that food plots should be, at least to some extent, safer than, say, baiting, congregating a bunch of deer over and over and over again under a deer feeder or something like that. So in my opinion, food plots are a great alternative to that for a few reasons. One, they're available 24 hours a day. Also, if a forage has been eaten in that particular spot, it's not likely that another animal is going to eat that spot again anytime soon. I mean, that forage has been removed. Just a couple of different reasons like that. Feeders oftentimes, they go off at a certain period and deer are running up to eat under it, and that can be a little bit dangerous with CWD. So with that being said, maybe consider plot size. I'm not familiar with any research, but at this point, if you are worried about this, go a little bit bigger with your food plot, spread out the area. But number one reason for this slide was always contact your local wildlife agency, wherever you may be in the country right now. Give them a call, say, hey, interested in planting a food plot. Chances are they could send you tons of information to help you be more successful, but also just make sure that you know the legalities there. Okay, we got that out of the way. So what are we planting? We know where we want to plant, how big we want to plant. We've come up with these ideas. So now we need to consider what we're going to plant. And two of the broad categories are your annuals versus your perennials. So your annual plants are going to complete their entire life cycle in 1 year. So grow, produce seeds, and die. And that's their life cycle. However, your perennials are going to continue to grow year to year to year. Sometime for many years. It just depends on the particular plant and how well you have helped it along with management. But annuals, no mowing required, which we'll address that here in a minute. That's not something to scare you from perennials either. Less herbicide, they're cheaper, and they produce a ton of more forage. They produce a lot of forage. However, I love annuals, but if I've got the room, I'm planting a perennial plot as well. And the reason that is because it can be a safety net. So say it rains and you can't get your tractor in the field. Say you had to work and you weren't able to get your food plots planted. It was just a rough year, whatever it may be. Your perennials will still be growing each year. And therefore, you can show up and boom, you missed out on your annuals, but your perennials can be a safety net for you. So just a couple of plants that I consider champion plants, and so does most other people, but oats and wheat, your cereal grains. There's also elb and rye, things like that, but your clovers, which there's tons of clovers. This one in the picture is Dixie Crimson Clover. As you can see how high it is with my lacrosse knee boot there. I mean, this stuff is one of my favorites, and it's really showed out on some of the properties I've used it on. And then also we've got your brassicas, things like purple top turnips and dwarf SX rape. Those are really the two that I'm more familiar with. And because this seems to be such a big thing, I wanted to give you my opinion on it. And this is just my opinion on it. Ryegrass. This is not to be confused with cereal rye, but ryegrass. I am not a fan. I do not like it whatsoever. I got into a 3-year battle with it during my research, and I will never introduce it to a property that I own. One of the reasons being is, so this picture on the left is me standing in a clover plot. However, you can't see any clover. In fact, all 15, this was one of our research sites that had all 15 of the forages planted. But there was ryegrass that we did not plant and that we controlled for, and we couldn't beat it. It came in, smothered every other forage we had out, and we just couldn't do anything with it. And still, that property can't be used for food plot research because this stuff still exists and there's not much you can do about it. You can get into a fight with it every year, but it will take years and years to actually get this stuff gone. Once it's introduced to a property, it's highly invasive. I've heard numbers of people planted it 20 years ago and it still shows up on a property every single year. I mean, this stuff is really hardy. It's going to show up and it's always going to look beautiful, green, lush, and beautiful. And that's why it's attractive. Chances are many of you have seen ryegrass growing in the back of people's trucks. I mean, you literally can spill the bag, get a little bit of moisture, and it's going to grow in the back of the truck. So it is a guaranteed deal. It's beautiful, green, lush, and it's going to grow every time. And that's another reason, I won't go on a rant, but that's another reason that you have to be very careful when you buy seed mixtures, because what seed companies will often do is they will put ryegrass in there, quite a bit of it, so that if everything else was to fail, you've still got a really green, pretty food plot. Another thing that you see here is even after this stuff dies, it creates this really thick thatch layer that can prevent other forages from growing. This poor chicory plant is trying to make it. Chances are it's underneath there baking. And I mean, this can be a really big problem. I was taught that this is not good stuff. And then I spent 3 years learning as to why this is not good stuff. And I personally will never introduce it to my property. And if you have it on a property and are interested in getting rid of it, it's time to go to war with it. And it may take you quite a few years, but I think you can be knocked back if you do it right. So all the cool season forages that I mentioned, and some that weren't mentioned, let's look at how much they're consumed by deer. So what this graph shows is the green is at a low deer density. So imagine few deer, lots of groceries. The medium is an orange, or the orange is a medium density. So lots of groceries, but now maybe we got a couple of a little bit of a competition. Maybe somebody already grabbed the honey bun. I got to go somewhere else. Then we go to the red here, and that's the high deer density. This is where things are competing. They're getting desperate. They're starting to eat forages they don't want to eat. This is where you should intervene and start knocking the deer density on your property down. But as you can see, a lot of these perform really well. Crimson, really, really good. Bercine clover, and most of the properties you encounter are probably going to be in the medium and unfortunately the high. But you can see a lot of these perform very well. But even during the high deer densities, ryegrass is not preferred. I mean, this is some of these research projects that have documented this, and people tell me all the time, well, they eat it on my property. They eat it on my property. And yeah, they probably do. But my question to you is there any other groceries on the property when they eat it? You know what I mean? So, and some of the research that's been shown is it's a last resort. So in other words, there's much better options out there that I would recommend before I went this direction. And some of these are great. And again, like we've been preaching this whole talk, it's about diversity, right? So I can't tell you Bercine is better than Crimson. It's going to vary by property and different things like that. Champion plants, warm season annuals. So these are things like soybeans that everybody's familiar with, cowpeas, lab, Alice clover, deer vetch. I personally am a fan of deer vetch. I love it. It's super resilient. It grows, and I've seen deer hammer it, and it seems to multiply overnight. It's just really good stuff, and they love it. Soybeans, of course, we know that to be an ice cream plant. They love it. The problem with soybeans is if you don't plant it in a large enough area, they will come in when it's young, they will hit it hard, and they will kill it, and then you will be left with nothing. Because all it takes is one bite when they're young and they're dead. This picture is actually cowpeas, and as you can see, they've eaten everything they can reach in that plot, even all the way up and down my exclosure cage there. So there's some options. And again, this is the same graph we saw earlier, except with the warm season forages here. And as you can see, some of these really show out. Of course, soybeans, even when deer density is low, they're going for it because they love it. And that can also be a bad thing. If your deer density is too high or you don't have a large enough area planted, it leaves you with nothing. So just some things to think about. Perennial plants. So this is like white clover. So this is like your Durana clover, your ladino clover, chicory, alfalfa, things like that, that can be really, really beneficial. Just to give you kind of a situation to where all plants aren't made for all properties. I've actually tried to grow alfalfa on a property and couldn't get it to happen. Maybe after years and years of amending the soil, maybe I can get alfalfa to grow. But again, this just shows you how picky some of these plants can be and how you got to really do your homework before you just go buy a bag of seed. This is one of the biggest considerations that I have when I want to put together a food plot. I want to extend the life of my food plot. So what I mean by that is if I can plant a food plot one time a year and make it last all year long, that's what I want to do. And you can do that for the most part. Again, remember this scale is going to change depending on where you may be right now. But this is an example that does apply. So if very simple mixture of oats, wheat, crimson, and arrowleaf, which is probably my favorite mixture. And this is the reason. Oats, as soon as you plant them, if you plant right before rain, give them 1 week. They're going to shoot up. They're going to offer nutrition immediately. If you've got wheat planted, it's going to follow up behind those oats. So as oats start to decrease, wheat's just now climaxing. As that starts to senesce and die out, your crimson's coming through. And then late in the summer, man, you've got arrowleaf coming through, and it's just really extended the life of your food plot. This is a very similar graph. It's basically showing the same thing, except now we've added perennial plants and our warm season plants. And what I show here, and this is not my graph, but a perfect example is all all year long. You have a food plot, a food source all year long, whether you're chasing turkeys or you're wanting to shoot deer or you're just taking pictures of birds, or if you're really trying to supplement nutrition on your property, you have a food plot all year long. And again, like I mentioned earlier, or actually I'm about to mention, you have to consider different things. Your perennial plot's not going to be in your annual plot. I did mention that earlier because each year you're going to come in and start disking to replant your annuals. You don't want to be disking through your perennial plot. So you've got to make sure that those are separated. So perennial plots always get their own plots, right? And annual plots are going to get their own plots. But one thing you could also consider is if you have the room, and again, don't let this hold you back, have fun with this. If you have the room, warm and cool season plots should be kept separately. And the reason I say that, and I ran into this, not necessarily with my research, but when I was involved heavily with helping with food plots and stuff, is some of these cool season plots would actually last a couple of months into when you would want to plant warm season plots. So you're actually coming in there with a tractor and disking this up, and you still had a month or two left on your Alice clover. And the opposite end of that, you've still got lab, or you still got cowpeas out there that are available, and you're coming in and disking up to put your clovers back in. So if you can separate that, it's great, but you should separate your perennial plots and your annual plots. So good information. Now we know where we're planting, how big we want to plant, what we're planting. We know all of that stuff. So now let's literally take all that and let's go build a food plot. It starts with the soil. As Paul said and explained it, how crucial this was, I can't stress this enough. I'm not sure what the price is now, but a couple of years ago, it was $8. I would go take a soil sample, drop it off, mail it in, whatever, and it was $8, and they would send back a very intuitive, easy to read analysis that showed me what the pH was, what the nutritional composition was of my soil. And also it would spell it out for you. It would tell me, Jacob, you need to go get 35 pounds of this fertilizer, or this many tons of lime. I mean, it's just too easy not to do. And you're shooting yourself in your foot if you don't do this. So please, the resources are out there. And I'll include some resources at the end of this that will tell you exactly what website to go to. And Paul gave you that too, but it's all over the place. Wherever you are, this is really easy to do and cheap. Okay, so here we are. There it is. That's the field. That's the food plot. We've got to turn that, and some of you are dealing with stuff that's much worse than this. I've seen it. It's head high. But we need to turn that into our food plot, our beautiful, lush, couple acres of clover and wheat and oats. So how do we do it? Well, first off, we got to get that vegetation killed and incorporated into the ground, or we've got to just get it out of there. Most of the time, you're going to use more than one tool. So I've actually went in and I've sprayed and then I've burned. If you can burn, then sure, burn. And then what you're going to try to do is disc that stuff into the ground. So what I like to do, what I typically have done is getting a burn time can be tricky, but I could go out there at any time and spray herbicide and give it a week or two to kill that vegetation. And then I'm going in there with a disc and I'm disking it under. And once you start disking, then you're just basically fine tuning. You're trying to break down those dirt clods into finer and finer things so that you can get your seed bed. But you don't have to have a big tractor. You don't have to have a big sprayer. I've got a picture of me here in a minute walking around with a backpack sprayer. And this picture in the bottom right is actually my uncle and his two horses pulling a disc to disc up a food plot for me. So you don't have to have a huge tractor and all that fancy equipment and drills and all that good stuff. Don't let any of that hold you back. I actually have more fun not having that type of stuff. So it's perfectly, not like I know the other side, but it's perfectly fine. Don't worry about that kind of stuff. So now we've kind of broken it up. We're starting to incorporate that disking in. And one thing I will say, and I can say it on this next slide too, but be really careful when you choose to disc. I've got myself in a lot of trouble disking when it was too wet. So what happens when it's too wet is these huge dirt clods roll up to the top and then they turn into concrete as they dry out. You really need to make sure the moisture in the soil is not too, or it's not too wet. It's the best way to say that. If it's too dry, your discs aren't going to do very well. They're not going to get into the dirt anyways. But if it's too wet, you create a mud hole. And as you can see in this top right picture, and this is part of the process, you're eventually going to keep disking and keep disking to decrease the size of these mud clods. But as you can see, you think about tiny seeds, which we'll talk about here in a minute. If you drop it in some of those crevices, we're talking about it 4 inches into the ground, and then you come back over and cover that up, that plant's not growing. So what we are looking for is, and I'm going to pause for a second and say, this fence panel dragging behind is just another tool, and I've actually used it. So don't let anything hold you back, whether you got to ride a bicycle and pull that thing, whatever it needs to be. These are really good tools, but you are working towards this right here. You want a firm seed bed, but fluffy soil, and it takes a lot of work. What you're seeing right now started out like that first picture, maybe not that extreme, but yeah, you've got to work at it. You've got to keep disking and keep knocking those particle sizes down until you get this powder that you can just pick up and let go, and it blows away with the wind. So now we have a good seed bed. We are ready to plant. Now we need to start getting our seeds together and making considerations. So one thing I'm not going to address here is the planting rate for this versus that, because that is easily attainable information. And it's not something that I remember. I go back every year and I refer back to the charts, the different publications that have come out, and I'll give you some information to address to get to those charts. But once I look up the seeding rate and I decided what I want to plant, I'm going to go to the co-op. I typically stay away from mixes, not because there's anything wrong with that, but I like the idea of picking whatever forage I want and mixing however I want to mix it. But what I'll do is say I want kindling red clover. I'm going to go buy a 50-pound bag of kindling red clover. And first off, you need to know how much you need. And this is kind of the point of this slide is you've really got to pay attention to these tags. So I buy a 50-pound bag of kindling red clover. I didn't get a 50-pound bag of kindling red clover. You have to calculate something called pure live seed. So if you look right here, there's 49.88% pure seed in that bag. So I bought a 50-pound bag, and it's got 25 pounds of seed in it, is essentially what that's saying. It's got about 50 pounds of, or 50% of seed, which is about 25 pounds. But the companies will also give you a germination rate. So only 85% of that seed is going to germinate. So 50-pound bag has 25 pounds of seed, and only 25 or 85% of that is going to germinate. So now that 50-pound bag only gives me 21.2 pounds of viable seed. So if I needed 50 pounds of kindling red clover to plot or to plant in the area I wanted to plant, I need to buy 2 bags of these, 2 bags of this at least to get to my 50 pounds. So if you were to just take this 50 pounds thinking you needed 50 pounds and you planted that, you really didn't even plant half of what you needed. And the tags are always on there. It's this really simple calculation. Always pay attention to this. It's really important. And always is not more. A lot of people like to, well, I'm going to double the amount that I plant. Well, you can get in a situation where plants are competing with each other. You've got too many plants trying to grow, and they're robbing the soil of the nutrients and the water, and they all just kind of turn out mediocre. If I was you, and then what I'm going to do is follow the recommendations that the professionals have figured out are the best planting rates and things like that. So another thing you got to consider is if you're going to plant a legume, they have to be inoculated. So what this essentially means is some of our warm season plants, like we mentioned earlier, cowpeas for this matter, you will also have to add a bacteria to these seeds. And what happens is this bacteria works with the seed or works with the plant to help it fix nitrogen and just overall do better. So while you're at the co-op and you're buying something like cowpeas, and you know that cowpeas are a legume and you know that you have to inoculate them, you also tell the co-op like, hey, I need a bag of inoculant for these seeds as well. And they're going to go to the back in the fridge and they're going to grab you one. And it comes just like seeds do. So you're buying this many pounds of seeds with inoculants going to say, well, we can treat this many pounds of seed. And it's very simple. What I like to do is mix sugar and water together to create a sticky substance. You can do this in a 5-gallon bucket or whatever, spray the seeds down, and then take however much of the inoculant that I need, and I spread it all over the seeds, mix it up real well, and you're ready to plant. This guy in the middle is actually spreading it out because you may want to let it dry out a little bit so it doesn't get stuck in your spreader. But yeah, now you've inoculated your plants and you need to put those in the ground, or your seeds, and you need to put those in the ground within an hour or two. That living organism that is that bacteria will die if you do not get it into the soil. So do not inoculate until you are ready to plant. Another thing we need to consider is planting depths. Just for a general rule, large seeds, 1/4 of an inch to an inch deep in the ground. Small seeds, 1/4 of an inch, no deeper than that, or then you can really cause problems. They're not going to germinate and pop up. This guy that's actually measuring, this is not something you typically do unless you're running a drill. I like to be just aware and maybe take things a little bit easier to make sure that I don't cover things too deep. But when you're using a drill, you'll actually run a pass, go out, dig that seed up, measure how deep it is, and then adjust your drill. But you can use, once you sow these seeds, you can use a what they refer to as a cultipacker, a big roller. You can run over it with your truck tires if you want to. I've often used a disc. You're not disking the seed in the ground, you're just fluffing the dirt over it. So your disc is barely touching the ground. And then also what's referred to as frost seed, where you actually just sow the seed out and then rain will come and you're making sure that you have good soil to seed contact, and that stuff will do really well, those really small seeds. But if you have a really firm, fluffy seed bed like we're wanting, you're not going to have any issues. You want direct seed to soil contact, and then of course be smart. Plant right before rain if you can. That's just going to help get these things going. And how to actually get the seed out. I've spent more time with one of those handheld things in my hand than anything else, but you can get 4-wheeler attachments, the handheld thing at Walmart for 25 bucks. Here's a seed drill in the bottom right. This was actually the crew that I was working with. We were changing over to a different forage, so they got the vacuum cleaner out and actually got all that other forage out. But so how do we manage these faux plots? May hurt some people's feelings here, but perennials, you just mow them once a year and you're not mowing annuals. So once per year in the late summer, you can mow your perennials. This will help with weed encroachment and things like that. In the Southeast, when people get bored, this is what it looks like. They are headed to mow the food plots. It's a recreational activity. They just have fun, and then they look at it and they're like, man, I did something. I'm managing it. Well, in fact, what you did was you just shot yourself in the foot. So again, I recommend perennials once per year in the late summer, and that's it. Herbicides, not going to spend a lot of time on that, but these are very, very important in weed management. And you have a couple of different classes of herbicides, non-selective. So whatever you spray it on, it's going to kill it. Grasses, specific herbicide, or broadly specific herbicide. One thing to pay attention to here is you want to know the active ingredient. There are lots of different brand names: Roundup, Eraser, Cornerstone Plus. The active ingredient is glyphosate. So you got to really do your homework on your herbicides. And these days it's super simple. And again, I will give you the stuff you need later to be able to seek out any of this information. Exclosure cages are absolutely critical. If you were to ignore what's in this exclosure cage and somebody said, man, you know, your food plot didn't do too well, you'd be like, no, it didn't. This looks pretty pitiful. I followed everything that Jacob said, and it's just sad. Well, what's going on here is the deer and other critters are hammering your food plot, which is exactly what you wanted. Always put your exposure cages out so you'll know what's going on. You'll know how well they did. I actually like to put cages out in maybe if I've got a field that's got a low area and maybe an upper higher area, I'll put a cage in each just to see how that plant responded with maybe a little more flooding, a little more water, or a little drier conditions. It may also influence what you want to plant next year. So successful food plots have a couple different things. Proper soil conditions. You've amended the soil, good fertilizer, good soil pH, things like that, good seed bed. You follow the proper planting techniques. You're using herbicides to prevent weeds from just completely overtaking it. And of course, rain and good conditions. How do they fail? Well, for the exact opposite. And then a couple of other things. Herbivory, if you've got deer that are just destroying these things so quickly, maybe you've got to drop your deer density down a little bit. Also, Mother Nature, you can't affect that at all. There were a lot of, in South Texas, a month or two ago, we had this freeze that was crazy, killed tons of plants, but you just can't control from Mother Nature. This is a big one. Food plots are not a substitute for habitat management. Why are you interested in even getting into food plots if you have not done everything you can to make sure that your property is reaching its potential. It's also a lot of fun. I think it intimidates a lot of people, but there are so many different things that you can do to increase the nutritional composition, bedding cover, all sorts of things on your property before you ever consider food plots. And I think you should. So we look here on the left, there's an example of a property, probably one I hunted growing up. I used to hunt stuff like this all the time, and I loved it. I loved it because I could see for 200 yards, and in my mind, deer were going to be everywhere. Well, in reality, what's happening there is that's a desert. There's no food, there's no cover, there's nothing there. Whereas on the right, we as humans typically see this as ugly. It's not aesthetically pleasing. But in fact, what we have here is a lot of nutrition, a lot of really good forages, and then a lot of cover. This is where you're going to find the critters that you're trying to find. Here's another example. Same pine stand on the left, you've seen one that's been managed. Probably some herbicide treatments, maybe some fires to remove the pine straw and stuff on the ground. You've got sunlight getting to the ground, and you've got forbs and legumes and really good stuff growing. This stuff on the right, it's a jungle. Chances are, if you were to walk 3-4 feet in there, it's then a desert because the sun cannot get to the ground. There's probably tons of straw that has built up over time. This is not where you want to be. That's not how you want to do. You want your property to look more like on the left. And I understand this is a pine stand, and that's different from what a lot of people are familiar with, but you kind of get the gist of what I'm talking about here. So one of the most important things we can do is open up the canopy. For us to have plants grow, we've got to get sunlight to the ground. So what we can do is go out there with a hatchet in hand or a chainsaw, and we can cut down those small, woody, undesirable trees, the sweet gums and all that other stuff that's popping up, that's literally plugging gaps in the canopy. We can cut those down, spray them with a little herbicide to kill them, or we can just let them fall over and act as cover or anything like that. I mean, it just depends what your goals are. But if we can get sunlight to the ground, we can stimulate oak generation. Legumes and forbs are going to grow. And essentially what we've done is removed, the sun came through. And another option that's really, really neat, instead of the herbicide, cut them down, let them fall, and create what is called a stump sprout. So imagine tree, lots of our big root system, uptaking tons of nutrients. And then when it starts to resprout, it pumps these nutrients into these little sprouts. Deer will hammer them. Things that you didn't realize deer would eat, they will start to eat them because of the concentration of nutrients. This is a red maple tree. This is not something deer are typically going to eat, but they hammered it nonstop because those huge root systems were pumping the nutrients into the shoots, and the deer were hammering. This is actually one of my cameras that I was running. This deer came up, ate every leaf off of that stump sprout, and then walked away. That stump sprout's going to continue to produce leaves, and that deer is going to come back. Another good option here is that you may present yourself with some hunting opportunities by finding these or creating these. Burning, everybody loves burning. I think a lot of people are scared of it, but this goes well with thinning. Once you've allowed sunlight to the ground, you got to get all that garbage out of the way, all that straw and the leaf litter and that kind of stuff. You can also, with burning, set back plant succession. So if you imagine succession as you clear a property, starts out as grasses, and then it turns into shrubs and forbs, and then it turns into small trees, and eventually it's headed towards really big forest, right? So what you can do is keep knocking back succession, preventing that from happening, and keeping it in the stage that you prefer, or better yet, that deer prefer in this situation. It also helps control woody encroachment, which is basically what I was saying, but removes the litter layer and stimulates seed germination. So especially if you've opened up the canopy, you've gotten all that garbage out of the way, you're going to start seeing really good stuff grow. I recommend a 3 to 5 years burn. You can also, if you have different areas across your property, burn one this year, burn one next year, and just rotate them. Again, you're increasing diversity, you're increasing the nutrition on your property and the things that these animals need. Disking, this is another good one. Sets back plant succession like we just talked about, can decrease grasses and undesirable forages. It also stimulates the growth of forbs and legumes. One thing I want to say is we're not talking about disking to make a seed bed. We're talking about a few inches in the ground and just a couple of times over and over, usually leaving about 50% of the residue on top of the ground. Again, you want to rotate this 1 to 3 years. And you can do this in different areas during different years. And one thing they refer to as disc stripping is where you strip it, you disc a strip, move over 30 feet, and your disc would be about 30, 40 feet, I guess. Move over 30 or 40 feet, skip that, make another strip, skip, make another strip, and so on and so forth. And again, your point is you're increasing diversity. So we're almost done. What am I saying? Diversity is key. There is no magic bullet forage. Our properties are not the same. The nutritional requirements are not the same across the properties. So manage your property to maximize plant diversity. Use these tools we've talked about to get the full potential out of your property, and then use food plots for fun to reach management goals, and also increase the groceries on your property. If I'm picking a food plot forage, I'm basing it on the conditions of my property. If I have a wetter property, maybe I'm going to something that's a little more water tolerant, and all the stuff that I'll give you later will easy to assess this information. I'm also assessing price. I want a mixture of plots. I don't want to spend all my money on one. So I'm going to, partition out and get a few different forages, because namely, I want to extend the plot, the food plot life. And mostly, this all comes down to give them the buffet. They're going to make the decisions and select based off of what they need and reach their potential. So as long as you provide the groceries and do what you need to do to provide those groceries, you should be okay. So with all of that being said, this took an army, and I appreciate everyone's help. And here's some really cool websites and stuff that you can check out. This stuff has easy to read publications and short articles and things like that. And all this will be recorded so you can get it later. But Cesar Claiborne Wildlife Research Institute, where I'm at now, University of Florida Deer Lab, this stuff's got I use it every day. I don't know all of this stuff by heart, not every bit of it. So I'll refer back to my manuals. Here's one in particular. Of course, this is for the Southeast, but yeah. Also, there are some deer plot apps and stuff. Check out the websites I give you. You'll see these apps that will allow you to do really cool things, keep up with your harvest records, things like that. Before and after the shot aging, these are handy to have in the deer stand with you, different things like that. But with that, I hope there are people still here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much, Jacob. We do have a few questions. Paul has been answering some of the questions in the Q&A pod about soils and fertilizers and things like that. But we do have a couple questions, and please, folks, feel free to type any questions in that you have. Paul and Jacob said that they would stay around for as long as you all have questions. So thanks for bearing with us a little bit over our time, but we'll go ahead and take those questions. The first one, in the fertilizer trials, did you add fertilizer by what the soil test was asking for per field, or did you just use a generic number across the board?
No, yes, we actually did do our soil analyses, and we added per recommendation. So instead of just coming up with an arbitrary number, we sent these tests off at Mississippi State University, actually, and then followed those recommendations to a T.
And Chris is asking, I believe it's a follow-up question. Let me double check that. Okay, so Chris's first question was in regards to a recommendation between ag lime versus pelleted lime. And Paul, please chime in on this one, versus products like Mojo K20. But the current question is similar question on herbicide recommendation for parts of East Texas. Yukon in East Texas.
Paul, going for that one, Lime?
Well, no, I think one of the first questions that they ask is to take out, I think it was a Japanese stilt grass and leave the clover. And I suggested that it was probably the select that you had just talked about as something that might take out the grass, but check the label to see if it is the one that's on the label as something that'll control. I think that other question was the follow-up question to that in East Texas. I didn't want to touch that. But that's,
Yeah, the herbicides they're intimidating even to me, and they shouldn't be. They because of the amount of information we have these days, the easily to read information, that kind of stuff. Um, in my experience in the Southeast, and again, you're supposed to stick to these recommendations very like to the T. If this herbicide says it's made for this plant, this plant, and this plant, you're not supposed to spray it on other plants. Not saying that people don't, but they can't guarantee what's going to happen if you decide to. I've used clethodim as the active ingredient in controlling grasses in the plots that I've had to deal with before. As far as East Texas, I'm not sure, but it would be really easy to get you some information that would help you out on that. My preferred chemicals, non-selective, I'm going Roundup, maybe Eraser because that's a little bit stronger. But again, that's glyphosate. If I'm going grasses, I'm going Tap Out, which is active ingredient in clethodim. If I'm going for broadleafs in my clovers, I'm going 2,4-D-B, which is very important, not 2,4-D, 2,4-D-B. But I would recommend you don't run with any of this just yet, and you just get the resources that you need, do a little bit of studying on that and making sure that you got what you need.
All right. So next question. Jacob, I've become a big fan of what I call the cocktail plots, including 5 to 7 species in one food plot. But it has made me wonder, is there such a thing as too much diversity? Are we running the risk of lowering forage production if we include too many species? Curious what your thoughts are.
Absolutely. I think so. Yeah, I think, and I mentioned a little bit earlier about following seed recommendations, so seeding rates and stuff like that. And I think what you can run into is if you've got too many plants trying to feed themselves from the nutrients in the soil and water and that kind of thing, they all maybe reach a mediocre level, but they're not going to be able to thrive. And this is kind of the same idea we've been talking about with deer this whole talk. They got to have the groceries, right? The plants are just another organism. They got to have the groceries to reach their potential. And another thing I could see as being a problem with having different mixtures like that is some are going to be more dominant. So if you have something that jumps up real quick and starts to outcompete everything else, then that may be what's going to be the dominant species in that food plot. If you're seeing really good results out of that, sure. If you wanted to knock it back next year and see what happens, I think that'd be great. But I definitely could see you not having enough nutrients and water in the soil to let all of those forages meet their potential.
All right, another question. Does pellet lime have any residual effect, or does it only last the year that you apply it?
I can take that one. Pelleted lime is just a finer grade lime that's in a pellet form. It just makes it a lot easier to handle. It's going to have the same residual effect as a regular ag lime if you put it on at the same rate.
Okay. Will plowing under a clover or wheat field improve organic matter, or will a crimp roller be better?
I'm actually not familiar with a crimp roller, but anytime you are adding organic matter back into the soil, you're giving those, whatever you're planting the next time, the nutrients that it needs. So especially when you're talking legumes and stuff, nitrogen fixing plants. Yeah, if you get those, incorporate those back into the soil, I definitely think that you are benefiting next year's plot or, whatever else you're trying to grow. Paul, are you familiar with a?
Yeah, the roller crimper is a pretty common thing for organic production, especially with rye. Usually we roller crimp our rye, vetch, and some of those things, like when the rye first starts to flower, and it'll stay down. My concern with the roller crimper would be, what are you going to try to do next? For being familiar with clover, usually in Michigan, we're doing a lot of June clover, Michigan mammoth. I would suggest that the roller crimper is not going to terminate it. It's going to be there and interfere with that next planting. It depends on what your plans are for your plot. I think really, you plow it down, you're gonna add that green manure, that organic material. and especially if you want to terminate it and add something new.
All right. Are there any last question? Or if you got some last questions, please fill those in either in the chat pod or the question and answer. Again, where can we send soil samples for testing? So I can field that one. Your local extension office can be a source of where you can get the soil testing kits and get the facilitate that process for soil tests to be submitted to your local university.
I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
You want me to take that next one?
Sure.
You know, part of the principles, if you look up the principles of soil health, part of it is having diverse crops in your rotation, and the reason is that you get a diversity of microbial communities instead of having just monocultures. You have those polycultures, those multi-species. I know Dr. Lisa Tiemann, our soil microbiologist, you know, she always recommends having at least one of the three functional groups, a grass, legume, and a brassica, because that'll kind of optimize your microbial diversity and building the soil health, build those microbial communities that's breaking down that organic matter, cycling the nutrients, making the plant available.
And the question that Paul just answered was, can you talk about the importance of crop rotation in soil health and how it can be utilized to grow better plots? So any other last questions before we wrap up? And just while we're waiting for those of you who are still on, as soon as the recording comes back from being closed captioned and gets posted on the Michigan State University Extension CWD page, I'll send you a link that has the recording. I'll send you the PDF of the slide sets from our presenters tonight, and also some of the links for the resources that are available that Paul and Jacob both talked about. So you'll get all of those, as well as a post-webinar survey. If you could take a few minutes and share your feedback about the webinar with us, that would be great. A couple of questions just came in. Can you disc too much?
I think you absolutely can, especially in certain situations. If you just get too crazy with it, and say you had a big rain come in and you start seeing erosion and different things like that. And then also, I think I feel like I had a better answer to this back in the day, but yeah, we'll end with that. I think you definitely can. You know, you're not trying to continue to dig down, and that's what you're going to do if you keep disking. You're going to get deeper and deeper and deeper. So what you would like to do is just get a really good firm seed bed, and you know, one you walk on and not fall through because of all the disking you've done. But yeah, I think you'll know when you get there.
I'd also add in support with a disc, you know, sometimes you don't want to make that granular. You don't want to make it to be powder, because all of a sudden you get a driving rain, you're going to create that surface compaction, and those small seeded grasses, legumes are just not going to be pushing through. You know, when it comes to tillage, my theory is less is more.
Yeah. I think we're actually headed that direction, right? A lot of people are trying to get away from it, but altogether, if they can.
Well, we're getting better tools and technologies that we can get that seed furrow open and closed, get that good seed soil placement, and kind of get the job done without a lot of that disturbance.
Yeah, a lot of the issues. So yeah, that's great information. To clarify what I meant earlier is, you want a firm seed bed with maybe just a little bit of what I refer to as powder on top, opposed to what I experienced in the Southeast with those clay soils, where you would create craters. So where you literally could drop a seed and it would go into a crater that's 4 inches under the ground. So to each their own, but yeah, that's actually that's great. Something I didn't consider, actually. That's really good information.
Yeah, so a question kind of along those lines is, I have a field that was a red pine forest. It's been clear cut and stumps removed. How do you go from a clay clumped soil to the powder?
That's a tough one. That's what I've dealt with on my study area. That's exactly what it was. It was clay soils. It was hard to amend. because they seem to be harder to change the pH of. They're harder to get the conditions to till them up, to disc them up like you want to. The problems that I have encountered is disking when it's too wet. You will really cause yourself some issues if you disc when it's too wet, because these huge craters will come up and they will, or huge dirt clods will come up, turn to concrete, and it's just such a pain. As far as to make it easier on yourself, don't do that to start with. Make sure that the soil conditions are in the right condition to be disking to start with, and then it's just a process. I personally find tractor time therapeutic, so I didn't mind it. But yeah, don't disc when it's too wet, especially not in the clay. You can really cause some problems.
There's a couple of things that we kind of use the old ribbon test to determine if your clay is too wet. You can, there's a couple ways. You take a ball about the size, you drop it from your waist, and if it holds together, it's too wet. Then you do the ribbon test. You basically take a handful, you squeeze it, you can push it between your finger and your thumb. If it goes out over a ½ inch and still holding, it's too wet.
I forgot about the ribbon test. Yeah, I've heard of that one.
Yeah, you pay for the sins of planting all season long, so don't work ground wet.
Yeah.
Okay. I've tried growing corn, not many years, but the intention was to plow it under later. Am I on the right track? And that's as a follow-up question after the club soil.
Paul, you want to take that one? My defaults, it's always good to incorporate organic matter, but I'm sure you know much more about this.
Yeah, I probably, corn on that situation, corn might not be my first choice. When I think of a situation like that, I think of patience. I think of having something growing. I probably would put like a rye in. You got to have a lot of roots growing. You got to get the fibrous root type plant into that soil. I might have, depending on where it's at, I might use a sorghum Sudan, an annual grass. They put a tremendous amount of organic matter out, and they put roots in the ground. But when I think of and then just be patient and continue to keep things growing, it'll loosen. You don't want to get to that powder. You want good aggregation, not powder. And live roots are going to create those soil aggregates, and it's going to give you those air spaces, that water infiltration, places for those roots to go.
Paul, I got a question also. As far as incorporating organic matter, would corn also maybe be a poor choice because it would be harder to break down, takes longer to break down in the soil?
It's going, yeah, the CN ratios on that's going to be pretty high as mature corn. And, depending on, you got to expose that corn stalk to either the soil surface so the bacteria, fungi can break that down, or, depending on a lot of different things, you can have, your worm populations can start breaking that stuff down, pulling those things in. Corn probably wouldn't have been my first choice. For that would be another reason.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Well, it looks like we have fielded all of the questions that are in our question and answer pod and in the chat. So again, thank you everyone for hanging with us a little bit later than 8 o'clock. I really appreciate it. Again, that recording link and resources. And then if you think of some follow-up questions, Jacob and Paul's contact information will be listed in that too. And please feel free to shoot them any questions that you might have. I'm sure they'd be more than happy to answer. So thank you to Paul and Jacob for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. And we hope you all have a great night.